Hi again. So we've been talking about different sampling methods, and this is how to get a good sample for usually for a survey or which is a type of observational method, different from an experiment, which we'll get to later. So we've been talking about how we need a representative sample. I just mentioned that in the last video. So I wanted to spell that out here. A representative sample is one that matches the characteristics of the population. So that's really important. Representative sample matches the characteristics of the population, whatever the population is. Okay, so think about if we were talking about our population of people in the United States, we would want to match it in terms of, as many variables as we can. For example, one would be age, race, ethnicity, gender, income level, urban, rural. You could think of all of these. Urban, rural. So you often hear about weighting, where they try to get each population and they weight it to match the demographics of the United States. We're not going to get that detailed. That if you want to know more about that, you can take another stats class. But we do want to know that we really want to have a representative sample, okay? And bias, which we're going to talk about in this video, are the bad methods of sampling and the biased methods and some other types of bias. So bias is any systematic failure. So it could be a failure in somewhere in the sampling method. So it's a failure to represent the population. And there's no way to fix biased data. So we can't just say, oh, well, let's just get our data and then we'll fix it later. No, you can't fix it later because you don't know what the bias is. If you did, you wouldn't need to do statistics in the first place. So if you're not representing the population, if it's not representative, then it's going to be biased some way, right? So there's no way to fix biased data. So it's better to design a good survey to begin with. It's an investment. So take the time up front, invest the time up front. Okay, now sometimes people think, well, we need a huge sample, right? But if you like cooking, use this analogy. Let's say you're making a big pot of soup or stew, and I'm going to draw my little soup pot here. It's about the extent of my drawing ability. Let's say you've got your stew or soup in there, okay? Do you need to eat the whole thing to know if it's good or not? Or to know if the carrots are done or the potatoes are done? No, you don't, right? You just take a sample. But don't you get a representative sample? Like you take your spoon and you dip around and you try to get some of the carrot and potato and broth and the meat or tofu or whatever is in there. Because you want to test all the things. You want to know if the salt level is right, spice is good, things are done but not overdone. If it's overdone, it's too late anyway, but you could pull it right off. So your spoon, when you get this, you kind of get whatever you want on your spoon, that's your representative sample, right? So it doesn't have to be huge. And we'll see that later on in the class, actually, it can be too big. We don't want that. So this, my drawing of this spoon, that's your representative sample, okay? Okay, so now let's talk about some bad methods. One of them, and some of these are used really commonly, so you'll probably recognize them. One of them is called voluntary or self-selected sampling. So this is any time when the subjects choose whether to participate. Okay, and of course, everyone has free choice, right? So I'm not talking about, consent, but these are things like, to give you an example, like online polls, email blasts, online reviews. Okay, and so that's why sometimes it's called self-selected, where people are self-selecting, they're choosing whether they want to participate or not, okay? And so what happens with this, the problem with this is really usually get really strong opinions, okay? So you have strong opinions, and it's hard to get the middle. Okay, so that type of bias is called voluntary response bias. I put it in the first column over here. That's a specific type of bias to this situation, okay? So if there's no follow-up, no incentive, we're not, what distinguishes this between like a census is we have to really, with a census, really make an effort to get each person. So this is where there's no follow-up, but just participate if you want, okay? So there's no incentive or follow-up. I mean, I guess sometimes people make an incentive for reviews, but okay, so does this mean we can't get any interesting information? Well, we can. Like, I still read online reviews if I'm going to buy something or go somewhere or, get an Airbnb or something. You can get good information. You can get, or I should say, you can get information, but you just need to be careful and take it with a grain of salt that you might be seeing only the extremes, only the love it or hate it, okay? And we definitely could not then infer back to our population based on this, okay? So we could get some good qualitative data if we wanted that way. Okay, another one is called convenience sampling. And this is what it sounds like, anything that's convenient for the researcher. Okay, so it's any method that is easy or convenient for the researcher or researchers. Okay, and so let's say I want to do a survey, so I want to get some data, so I sample my class. Or my coworkers. Okay, if I ask my friends or neighbors. Okay, so this is called a convenience. There's a convenience bias as well. Okay, and this is a problem because if I'm trying to get good data, my people I work with or my friends or neighbors might share similar views, and so I might be getting this bias of something similar to me. And or let's say someone did have a different opinion, they might not feel comfortable sharing that. So that's another possible thing for convenience bias. So we don't want to do that. We want to stick with the random methods, right? Simple random sample, cluster, stratified. Okay, so then there's a few other types of bias that aren't necessarily a sampling method, okay? So I wrote additional types of bias here. So I've got a bunch of types of bias, and there are even more. I'm sure you've heard of more that aren't even on here, like cognitive bias. We're just doing a few types of bias. Okay, so the first one we'll talk about is selection bias or undercoverage. Okay, it's also called sampling bias. Okay, so this is really, it can be anything where the sample's not representative. That's due to the method. Okay. Use a different color for that. When the sample is not representative due to the sampling method. Okay, so let's say if our population, another way to think of it is the sample doesn't match your population, right? That's what representative means. It's not representative. So let's say we had a PCC survey, but we only ask Southeast. Or maybe we only ask in-person classes and we don't ask online. Students who take online, maybe we leave out online students. Okay, that's actually a big group of students, so we would have a bias there. Another example, maybe we do a phone survey and we only call cell phones. Okay, or only call landlines. That could be another. That would be another example of sampling bias or selection bias or undercoverage. I do like the word undercoverage because that has a good explanation of like we're not covering the entire population. So I kind of like that. Okay, a couple more. There's non-response bias. Okay, so non-response bias is when someone, it is what it sounds like, someone doesn't respond. Okay, we can never, we can't force people to participate, right? We don't want to force people to participate. So this is different than voluntary, okay? So this is after using a randomized method or while using a randomized method. I'll say when using a randomized method, someone doesn't participate. Okay, that can happen. And, I would probably expect that to happen, but we try to make that as small as possible, right? And we try to make sure that that's not aligned along any type of variables that we're interested in, okay? So if an example, this would be like any survey and someone doesn't fill it out. I'll say someone selected doesn't agree to fill out the survey. My writing's getting a little rough. So things we try to do for this are provide an incentive, follow up, and sometimes what people do is then select someone else so that it's another random person, so we still meet the sample size. So substitute randomly select another. Those are some things you can do to try to make that as small as possible. Because we honestly can't force people to participate. Okay, then the last one is called response bias. So it sounds like it's the opposite of that one, but it's slightly different. Response bias is anything in the survey that influences someone's response. Okay, so let me write that down. Anything in the survey that influences someone's answers. Okay. There have been studies on this. Things that can affect people's response are like question order that can affect people's answers. Could be a leading question. It's written in a certain way that sort of makes you, leads you to one conclusion over another. A loaded question. And also if something's not anonymous. Let's say there's a workplace survey about drug use or something, and it's not anonymous. You're not going to answer that. Okay, great. So that gives you a lot of ideas about bias and bad sampling methods, okay? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.